Hello travelers, and welcome back to the Architect's Forge. In this episode, we will be discussing the First Anointed, the Anointed Officer that is available in the Beyond the Song of the Dormant box. While there is no specific model for the First Anointed, you can use whatever you'd like. For example, you could use Urkala the Maw, or you could use one of the Anointed from that box or from Warcrow Adventures to represent the model. With that, let's dive in, as we always do, with a bit of lore. The First Anointed, as their name suggests, are the First Anointed created by a given progenitor, and as such, they hold a special place in their master's heart. Over time, the progenitor will modify and improve their First Anointed, but not with experimental improvements. Rather, they will instead apply the modifications that they have found have been proven to be the most effective and safe. If for whatever reason a First Anointed is lost, be it in battle or in an unfortunate accident, the progenitor will not take long to replicate and recreate their First Anointed as close as possible, replacing them with a new First Anointed. At times, progenitors will send their First Anointed to fight alongside other progenitors. In this way, they can show off their masterpiece while having a loyal and trusted agent infiltrate amongst the ranks of another progenitor. While they are unlikely to admit it, at times some progenitors will even hold their First Anointed in higher esteem than other elves. And now that we know what a First Anointed is, let's look at their profile. But before we do, I quickly remind you that if you're enjoying this content, please like, comment, subscribe. If you have any thoughts about what we're going to go through with the profile, I always look forward to hearing what you think in the comments below. I'm sure we will have different views. I have strong views when it comes to the First Anointed, and I'd love to hear if you have the same or different views. So let's get into it. As always, we'll start by looking at the basic stats of the First Anointed. Now, the First Anointed is a character that may attach to other units, so we'll start by going through their unattached form and then proceed to their attached form. The First Anointed comes in at I'd say average for an officer character cost of 25 points. This isn't an insignificant amount. You could get, for example, a full unit of intact for less, but for what they bring and what they can do, this is a reasonable cost and to be expected for an officer of this nature. With them, they bring a command token, which is always nice, allowing you to use some of those limited abilities throughout the faction. As I've said, the First Anointed is an officer, and this means that they will be the last model in the unit to be destroyed, and that they will become the leader for the purposes of basing coherency. This is a particularly important ability to keep note of when it comes to small units like the Anointed themselves. Because those units degrade when they drop from 2 to 1 model, an officer, like the First Anointed, that counts as an Anointed, makes it so the unit will not ever drop to their weakened profile. Now, the First Anointed is slow. They only move to 3 and have a charge of 8. This is unfortunate, however, because they will at least start the game generally attached to a unit, this becomes less important, and by the time the First Anointed is likely outside of a unit, they're probably already in the thick of the fight. They have a wound stats of 3, which, while not particularly high, is good. It's not a fragile 2 wounds like some other characters that we've looked at, for example, the breath, but it's not going to keep them around for long. It'll help them survive maybe an attack, and then they'll probably go down. The First Anointed has a good whip of orange and yellow, not particularly special. And then when it comes to the morale value, it has a morale of 3, which is quite high. This allows the First Anointed to either activate at quite a few times in a round, or it also lets them stress. As we'll see, the stresses on the First Anointed really do help them stay alive. So help boost that 3. This morale 3 allows them to, again, keep around doing stuff for longer. They are only availability 1. Whether you would bring more if you were allowed to, I'm not 100% clear, but you can't. So no need to dwell on it. Looking at some of the skills, keywords of the First Anointed, we see that the First Anointed has the Intimidating 1 ability. This means that whenever the first time in a turn that they engage or are engaged, your opponent must make a willpower roll, and if they fail to get a success, they will gain a point of stress. This can just provide a little bit of extra stress, and that's always nice to have. First Anointed also has the Join ability, allowing them to join a unit that is both infantry and human. At the time of recording, this is the Intact, the Anointed, the Marked, and the Marked Marksman. We may see more units that they can join in the future, but for now, that's what they can join. Now, this does mean they can't join things like Husks, and they can't join things like Echoes, and they can't join any of the Redcaps. So it is a way to just keep an eye on what they can and can't join when we're thinking about what synergies and where you might want to play these guys. Finally, unlike a number of characters, they do have 1 conquest, which means even if they're not in a unit, they are contributing to the holding of those important objectives, which is always nice to have because when it comes down to it, scoring points is how you win the game. Moving on to the attack. The First Anointed is attacking with a red to orange dice and then generating a shield. This means they average about 2.4 successes per attack with a maximum of 4. This is decent damage. It's not especially scary, but for a solo character, it is, I'd say, about average. They aren't a massive scary damage dealer, but they'll do some damage. Of note, and as interesting as the attack profile is, they do have a guaranteed shield, 2 if they choose to stress. And this can really help protect those 3 wounds against units that have the ability to do hits in their defense rolls, either automatic hits or switches that lead to hits, or just having red, orange, or yellow dice. This is particularly nice when you're going to something like Northern Tribes, where you see a lot of this hitting in defense. Now let's look at the switch. The First Anointed have 1 switch, and it's an interesting one. It'll cost 2 specials, which on the red into orange, you're averaging about 1.25 specials with a max of 3. So on average, you won't get this trigger, but if you do, what it allows you to do is suffer a stress and inflict 1 damage. This isn't 1 success or 1 hit, this is just 1 straight damage. Now, auto damage is strong, however, having to also spend a stress does make it so this switch is expensive. While you might not do this always, it is something that's nice to have, and you do have that 3 morale, so there is a higher chance of you having stress to spend. Moving on to the defense. The First Anointed comes in with a green, a blue, and a black die in defense. This means they average about 1.63 shields with a maximum of 4. And if they stress, they get to add a shield and exclamation mark, bringing the average up to 2.63 and the maximum to a 5. This is fairly consistent to get a little bit of blocks in, which is nice. Again, helping protect that damage. They aren't going to survive a massive attack from a particularly combat-focused unit, but they can tank to some extent. Now they again have 1 switch that costs 2 specials. They are averaging 1.63 specials with a maximum of 4, and when they stress, they do get an additional, bringing that average up to 2.63 with a maximum of 5. And now what the switch is you can spend 2 specials to just add an additional block to your roll. This effectively increases the average defense dice of the First Anointed by about 1 shield. This means that your average goes up to about 2.63 or 3.63 if you are stressing. Overall, with that ability and having the decent morale, so being able to stress more likely, this does allow the First Anointed to be more durable than many other solo characters. Now that we've looked at the off attack and defense, we'll move on to their one skill, and that is Bone and Sinew. For those that watched the video on the Anointed or have looked at their card, you'll know this ability looks similar, and that is because it is identical to the Anointed ability of the same name. What the ability is it allows you to spend both your actions for the turn, and it will allow you to target an enemy within 8 strides and pull them towards the First Anointed. But in order to do so, you must first make a roll with 2 orange dice and get a success. It is important to recognize that you can place the enemy. So when you pull them in, you get to do a place. It's not truly a pull. And what that means is you can choose to place them engaged with another unit. So for example, if the First Anointed was to leave the unit they were in, pull an enemy in, they could place the models the models so that they are touching both the First Anointed and whatever unit they just left. This can allow you to get the nice gang up bonus. Also, by pulling them in, this could mean that the First Anointed is able to stay standing on an objective without having to charge off of it to get to an enemy. Alternatively, this could allow the First Anointed to pull an enemy off of an objective that they were trying to defend. Now, there is a risk because you do need to roll a success on those 2 orange dice, but on average, you should get about 1.2 successes. So on average, you will succeed on the roll. But it is important to recognize it is a risk, and if you fail, you've wasted an entire precious activation. So that's what the First Anointed has on their unattached part of their card. Now let's look at what I consider the more interesting part of their card, which is what they provide when attached to a unit. Like with the unattached, we'll start with the basic bonuses that they bring. The card says Vol, which is the Spanish. It is the whip, and what this means is that the First Anointed gives the unit that they join an additional orange dice on their whip roll. It's important to recognize because it says plus orange, it means it's additive, as opposed to if there was no plus, it would mean it would replace their willpower. Now, additional willpower is always nice. It helps the units stay around and not flee. But it also is nice for certain feats, for example, Track and the Rift, where a unit with a character has to make willpower rolls, and you need to get in Track, you need to get 2 successes or 1 and then stress to gain an additional 1 in order to successfully track the vestige, or in the Rift where you're needing to sit on an objective, and the more successes you can get on your willpower roll, the less time you have to sit there defending it. Kind of going hand in hand with that, the First Anointed provides the large morale boost of +2 morale. This makes it so the unit they're in can activate more often, can stress more often, can choose to stress to not get pushed, for example in the Rift if you're trying to just stay on an objective and are not immovable, and also allows units that have other ways of using morale, for example the Anointed, it gives them more opportunities to do so. The final addition before the attack and defense that we'll look at is the First Anointed provides a conquest. This is fairly common in officer characters, but it is always nice to get additional conquest on a unit. As I've said before, conquest and scoring objectives is how you win the game. Moving on to the attached attack profile, we'll see that the First Anointed does not provide any extra dice or automatic successes. However, it does provide a fairly easy to achieve switch of one special, and that special will allow you to add a block to your roll. This really helps the First Anointed give their unit an ability to protect themselves from those units that provide hits while defending. This is particularly nice when facing, as I've said before, things like the Northern Tribes. It really can help make it so you take less damage when you're attacking, and also help ensure that you're winning those combats. Moving on to what they add to defense, the First Anointed adds a automatic shield, which is always nice. Guaranteed defense is always what you'd like to see when you're defending. As well, it provides a special or a switch for two specials that lets you add one block to your roll. So it's the same as on attack, just it takes one extra special. As I said, it's always nice ways to get extra blocks in defense, because when you're defending, that's what you're looking for. You're trying to get as many blocks as possible. With many units getting on average one or two specials, this means that the First Anointed will often be essentially adding 2 blocks to your defense roll. So that's what they add on attack and defense. Let's look at the 2 skills that they bring to their unit. The first one is an interesting ability. It is a command token ability called Bring Me Their Head. You can do this at the beginning of the unit's activation. Now it's important to note this does not cost an action, it's just a command token. And what it lets you do is roll an orange dice. If you get a success, a unit you engaged with suffers 1 damage for each level of stress on them. Now, free damage is always nice. If you've been fighting a unit, enemy, and let's say they're near stress cap, maybe they are a higher morale unit, so they have a bunch of stress on them, or 2 or 3. This is a fairly consistent way of getting to some automatic damage before your unit likely is going to attack them. This is fairly likely to get off, with an orange having a 62.5% chance of getting a success. So if you have the command token to spare and you're engaged with an enemy with a stress or 2 on them, this is always a nice way to just get some extra damage. Second ability that they bring is called Firstborn. It's a very straightforward ability. It's a passive ability that just grants your unit raging. This simply means that your unit gets an extra automatic hit when they charge. It's straightforward, but extra damage is extra damage, and it kind of goes nicely, allowing the First Anointed to provide a boost to damage output as well as providing that boost to defense that we saw earlier. Now that we've kind of looked at what the First Anointed's bringing, I want to walk through an example of what the First Anointed kind of brings to a unit, looking at the First Anointed in a unit of Anointed. So let's see what the First Anointed does for the Anointed, beginning with the attack. So as I had been saying, the First Anointed does not directly provide any additional dice or damage to the Anointed's attack roll, unless we're talking about the charge, in which case the raging kicks in and gives them another automatic success. Now, it does provide that easy switch of one special that we talked about, allowing them to convert specials into shields and protect themselves from damage. With their base roll, the Anointed are getting about 2 1/4 specials or 3 1/4 when they stress, which means that if you're taking 2 or 3 damage back at you, let's say your green die doesn't roll any blocks for itself, well, now you can actually block that damage, which can be quite nice. Now it is worth noting that if you're using your special in that, you're not using specials to cancel enemy blocks, but having the option allows you to adjust up and down depending on whether you need to push more damage through or block more damage coming back at you. It's also worth recognizing that because the First Anointed gives the Anointed an additional 2 morale, it makes it a lot easier for the Anointed to justify stressing to give themselves that extra hit and that extra special. An Anointed with the First Anointed on the charge when they stress, as you'll see me do in a number of my battle reports, before rolling dice has 3 automatic hits, which really means they start putting out much better consistent damage, right? A guaranteed hit is better than a dice that could get a hit. The only die that's better than an automatic hit is a red die that could potentially get you 2 hits. So it doesn't provide as much in terms of raw output for their attack, but it adds a bit more consistency as well as giving them an option to protect themselves from those, red, orange, or yellow dice or hits that the target of their attack might be sending back at them. Having gone through the attack, let's look at the defense and what the First Anointed does there. First and foremost, automatic guaranteed defense, always good. That's already boosting their defense. It also gives them the switch to use 2 specials to add a defense. This is another way to get extra shields. And when you pair this with something like Bone Armor, which is the Anointed's ability to spend stress and a command token to set a dice, you can actually really work towards trying to win a combat. For example, what you can do is set the yellow die to an exclamation mark and a hit. That gives you a hit into your opponent, again, helping with that balance of who's going to win the combat. Will give you an exclamation mark, which is halfway to giving you another shield. Now, a lot of people might think initially it's better to set a green die to 2 blocks. While 2 blocks is nice, a green die is much more consistently going to get you at least 1 block, whereas a yellow die is likely to not. Now, if you're really focused on blocks and not concerning yourself with damage, you could use the yellow dice and set the yellow dice just straight to 2 exclamation marks, which is essentially turning the yellow dice into a full block on its own. Now, using Bone Armor and stressing is a heavy commitment, but sometimes if you really want to try and win a combat while also and survive a lot of damage, that combination of using Bone Armor and stressing is something you might consider. And because the Anointed are up to 4 morale, thanks to the First Anointed, it's something you can actually consider doing, whereas normally an Anointed without the First Anointed, with only 2 morale, really can't justify spending both of their morale just to try and win the combat and do both of those things. Thanks to the switch and the guaranteed block, the First Anointed increases the average defense roll of an Anointed from 2 blocks to over 4. And if you stress, the average actually gets closer to 5. So this is a very substantial amount of blocks, especially when considering how much most enemies put through on average. The average enemy attack will likely get hits through against 2 blocks. Once you start getting into the 4 or 5 range, the odds of you actually blocking all the damage or blocking most of it and then pushing through a little bit of damage yourself and winning the combat goes up a lot. So it's really helping with the defense there. So that's kind of why I'm very interested in having the Anointed as the party that goes with the First Anointed. On top of the fact that the Anointed degrade fairly heavily. I'm not showing the degraded profile here because if the First Anointed's in the unit, you'll never get to it because the Anointed will never have less than 2 models until both of them are dead. So we'll now proceed quickly just to the final analysis summary of the First Anointed in its entirety. When it comes down to it, the way I think of the First Anointed is that it is a jack-of-all-trades officer in that it provides good boosts to both offense and defense of the unit that it joins. As I said, this is particularly effective with the Anointed, who themselves are kind of a jack-of-all-trades unit. So having a jack-of-all-trades unit boosted by a jack-of-all-trades officer kind of pushes up both. Now, a unit that was okay at attack and okay at defense becomes actually good at attack and good at defense, whereas normally jack-of-all-trades can sometimes suffer from being decent at both but not good enough at either. The First Anointed also really synergizes well with a number of the Anointed's abilities, things like the Bone Armor, that really rely on stress. And unlike a lot of Science units, Anointed do have good stress options, abilities to stress to get extra hits and exclamation marks. So that ability to add a whole 2 morale really synergizes with what the Anointed want to be doing. And as I've said as well, it keeps them at full strength. A unit with 2 models with an actual officer in them essentially never degrades, which makes it so, part of the cost and value math of units is okay, but we can make them this good, but they're going to get weaker. So we can balance how good they are because they're going to get weaker. When you never go to the weaker profile, it means that you get a lot more benefit and more bang for your buck. And aside from being attached, the First Anointed themselves are a fairly effective solo unit. I wouldn't ever run them solo from the start, but because they'll be the last ones to die, and the odds are they probably will survive the attack that takes out the Anointed, it means that at that point you now have a fairly effective solo unit that can run around, do some punching, and even have some conquest to steal points in the late game. So that's the end of this episode and this installment of the Architect's Forge. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about the First Anointed. Have you tried this combo? If you haven't tried it yet, try it, then come back and report. I'd love to hear how it goes for you. As always, like and subscribe, ring the notification bell so that the next time an Architect's Forge comes out, YouTube will let you know it's happening. If you do feel like you want to support the channel financially, I do have a link to a Buy Me a Coffee in the description below. Any funds that come through for that, I just invest right back into the channel, trying to continue upgrading the quality of the videos, especially the battle reports. But as I've said, the main way you can support is really with that liking and subscribing. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Good gaming.